Hey everybody, so in this episode I interview IFBB pro Mark Dugdale, who has been competing in bodybuilding for 24 years. He's competed in over 30 pro contests and has competed at the Mr. Olympia 5 times. So he's competed at the highest level of bodybuilding for a long time and has a lot of unique experiences that come along with that when it comes to the sport. He also has, I think, unique perspective because of some of the other areas of his life as well. He's been married to his wife for 20 years. He's co-owner of a fresh foods company that's been successful for a long time. He's pretty outspoken about his faith in relation to his decisions that he makes in his life. And I think the combination of competing at a very high level in that and then seeing his other priorities is really useful from a standpoint of his, my hope is that everybody watching that these episodes will help you in developing your own mental approach and philosophy, and not necessarily that you're going to adopt every single thing that every guest on these episodes has to say, but that it'll help you in developing your own perspectives on things as you move forward. So, I asked Mark some kind of unique and some tough questions about how, he defines himself, how he reconciles some of his beliefs with some of the challenges that come along with training and things like that. And I think it's a little different, but it's really useful, and I think can help everybody listening to this as they again, work through your own perspectives and develop your own mental approach. And we talk about, off-season competing and the challenges with that, what he sees as things that younger bodybuilders can improve on as they move forward and things like that too. So I think there's a lot of really good information. We had a good conversation, and hopefully it's helpful to everybody.
Welcome to the Peak Mental Performance Podcast with Joe Schillero, optimizing your mental health and athletic performance one episode at a time.
2, 1, and we are live. So thanks for doing this with me today, Mark. I appreciate you taking the time for kind of to give you an idea of what this series is about. Is, as the name kind of reflects, we're talking about the mental side of competing and training and all the things that go into that, and kind of alternating guests between people who are kind of experts specifically in the psychological mental health side, and then athletes who have unique perspectives or unique experiences with their careers as they go through competing. So I know a lot of people, myself included, really enjoyed the talk you gave at the underground strength session we did at Elite, and you hit on some really good topics through that, and kind of some things I thought a lot of people that weren't there would still like to hear. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I appreciate you having me on your podcast, and happy to give you my 2 cents. I'm certainly not, I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but I have been competing for over 20 years. So
yeah,
there's a fair amount of knowledge, I guess, that you gain over that period of time of competing. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's things that there's probably some things that both bodybuilding competitors or people interested in bodybuilding and then just general athletes and people in general can kind of glean from. So to kind of just generally start off, how have you seen, like you said, you've been competing, over 20 years in bodybuilding, all these sports like bodybuilding, powerlifting, all these things that we work a lot with, they're such physical sports that I think sometimes people concentrate so much on that they forget how much of the mental side of things goes into it. So how have you seen the role that just your mental perspective has played in how you're able to perform with bodybuilding over the last 20 years?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a huge aspect to competing in bodybuilding is mental. And that goes both for competition day to the dieting process to the off season. And each one of those, I would say, has their own unique set of mental challenges, if you will. And I saw a kid in the gym just the other day. He had walked in and I knew he had been training to compete, and he was telling me how his first competition went and how he was hooked, and, asking him, how did that go? What was the experience like? It reminded me a lot of my early days competing, of things that, you do it for so long, you kind of take it for granted. And the one thing I remember, especially, I guess, on an amateur level coming up from a mental standpoint on competition days is, and I told him, you know, when you walk in to go weigh in, mentally, it'll be hard to see that huge dude in clothes that's in your weight class, because you're in your head, you're going to be like, oh crap, that dude's massive. But I'm like, that's not the guy you got to worry about. You got to worry about the guy that looks like nothing in street clothes, because that's the guy that actually dieted. And when he pulls his clothes off and gets under those lights, he's going to look ridiculous. And the other guy's going to look like he dieted on Bud Light. So yeah, there's the whole mental aspect of, you know, if you have to weigh in or not. And, you know, honestly, it's just evolved so much. The mental aspects I deal with now versus early on, I think, are quite a bit different. And, you know, thinking back to my years in the amateur level before I turned pro, you run into a lot of guys. I would say the biggest mental challenge that I see off season for guys coming up is it's related to drug use. And you see guys that like will get on testosterone and they'll be in the gym, like super disciplined, training their ass off, and will get ready to go compete. And then as soon as the show's over, like they can't ever train without testosterone. And that's, I always said early on, I'm like, the mental tough guys are the guys that are in the gym, not taking anything, that are training as hard as the guy that's all jacked up. Because the guy that's jacked up, if all he can do is train like that when he's jacked up, he's never going to survive, because you can't live on testosterone, you know, indefinitely. And so that was, I would say early on, that was kind of a mental thing that I noticed, that there was a lot of guys that just didn't have the drive and motivation inside them if it wasn't fueled by external chemicals. And so they would, you know, when they stopped working out, as soon as the show was over, I knew those guys are never going anywhere.
Right.
Because, you know, as soon as the contest was over, you know, usually you should take a week off or something, but I was always the guy that was back in the gym on Sunday morning after competing Saturday night. Like, all right, man, let's go. What's next?
Right.
You know? And then, you know, pre-contest, the process of dieting just messes with your head. And a lot, I would say most guys can't really deal with that. And from that standpoint, it's probably best to have a coach, somebody that can objectively assess your physique as you're progressing to a contest. Whereas, you know, most guys, if they don't do that, the ultra disciplined guys will over diet, but more often than not, it's the guys that think they're ripped and they're 2 weeks out, but they're really 8 weeks out, and they just can't look at themselves objectively in the mirror. Like, they may be in their best shape for themselves, but like, you're getting on stage, like, you got to be lean.
Right. And
in bodybuilding, to a large extent, you know, being lean is green fees. Like, if you can't come in lean, doesn't matter how much mass you have, you're not going to get looked at. So I would say that's probably one of the toughest parts mentally for people getting ready. I mean, I've always been pretty good about being honest with myself, but Christina, my wife, is more honest with me than I am with myself. And you need somebody like that, you know. And it's crazy because she sees things not only that I don't see, but that even people that I respect in the industry, that I would think they know what they're talking about. We're going to be married 20 years in August, and she's definitely seen me compete a few times.
Yeah, I'm sure that's helpful too, that at that point when you guys are engaged, you're past the, trying to blow smoke up each other's ass stage. So she's being honest with you.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
That's great. I think one of the other things that was really interesting that you mentioned is, and it's actually something that I talked about in the first episode I did with the sports psychologist for OSU, and I'm going to talk to Dr. Serrano a little bit about it too, is I think a lot of people, and it doesn't get talked about a lot, they look at the competition day as like the finish line and they don't think of anything past that. And then it's like they have this emotional just like crash when it's done. And that's even for drug-free guys. And then if you throw in, like you mentioned, if you ramped your drugs up going into the meet or the show or whatever you did, and then you come off those, it's like a lot of guys and girls just don't seem to be like prepared for what that looks like. And I think people, they think of like, oh, mental toughness is going to be pushing really hard going into it. But I think it's equally as much, like you said, like in the off season, keeping sane and still training, even when you're not at your best, because it's humbling.
Yeah. That's interesting that you say that because, early on, I didn't have such a long range mindset that I do even now. And I even fell for some of that coming off a contest. You see guys go out and binge eat, and I admit I've done it. It was quite a long time ago, but I have done it, and so now, the day of the contest is just the day that you want to peak. But if you're peaking the day of the contest, like it doesn't just end there, like you said. Like I literally go right back on my diet, and because I don't want to peak and then crash, I peak and then taper off. And so there's a lot of discipline that has to go into that month after the contest to be like, no, I'm not going to just go eat whatever I want. I'm going to add 500 calories a day and, slowly work my way back into it. I'm going to train the same way and slowly, pull the volume back off on cardio if you're doing that. But yeah, you can't just go for that one day and then it's over and you just throw everything out the window. And that takes a lot of mental toughness because when you got to get on stage in your underwear, that's motivating. But as soon as that's over, for a lot of guys, that's really the hardest part at that point, to be like, all right, let's intelligently back things back off.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think strength athletes like powerlifters see the same thing in terms of their numbers. Like it's hard for them to go in the gym when they're like, well, I'm not going to be hitting some of my all-time or even close to my all-time best numbers. And it's like a level of humility that you have to like keep chipping away even when there's nothing really to show off. Right.
But there's still value in going in and,
absolutely.
and doing that training, even if it's not your best, rather than don't go in at all,
Yeah, for sure. So with, you've competed in so many top level shows and over a long period of time. And it seems like you have pretty good relationships with a lot of other competitors. And you've had a chance to see a lot of these different competitors that have won the biggest shows, on the biggest stages. What are some characteristics that have stuck out to you from some of the other competitors that are at the highest level? Like, what are some things that you think are unique to them, maybe versus the average competitor or somebody that's not quite at that high level?
That's a really interesting question. I could take guys like Branch Warren and say, yeah, that guy's mentally tough. And there's a lot of other guys that are very high level competitors, and I don't want to use names, but you would be surprised from my perspective how mentally weak they are. I've had guys, that were winning the Olympia that I had become, friends with. Like literally we're in Vegas and they're like 5 days out from the Olympia, and they're texting asking like, how do I carb up? And I'm like, why are they asking me that? Especially right now.
Yeah.
But I think that's just one more piece of evidence that proves that it is mentally tough. It's not like it's any easier for the guys at the very top. In fact, I would say in some senses, it's even more difficult because there's just that much more pressure on them. I mean, the best guys definitely have the best genetics, and you do have to be mentally tough to just keep plugging along, and try not to take things personal. Like it's hard for people to not take things personal in bodybuilding. Like I mean, I haven't competed in powerlifting, but in some ways I almost think critiquing, you lifted 780 instead of 820, like that's not, it's like the pounds are outside of the individual in a way. And so it's not taken so personally, but when you say, your arms are too small for your physique,
right.
And I'm just trying to be constructive, like it becomes very personal. And so I think that creates some difficulties with bodybuilding.
Yeah, I'd imagine that's got to be tough for coaches and just for training partners and people to give feedback when, I mean, you're literally commenting about somebody's looks and a lot about them.
Yeah.
So one big thing that I wanted to talk to you about was, and kind of along those lines of, bodybuilding is a sport, where you're essentially, your success is judged on how people view you. So, you have the judges there for a lot of competitors that also have sponsorships and things like that. Like your success is really dependent on how others are going to view you, and both physically and then, how you present yourself, all these different things. And particularly for you, as I know, you're a follower of Christ, and a big part of that is finding your identity in God versus identity in other people. How do you navigate, you're competing at such a high level, so you have to be concerned with how others view you. How do you continue to put effort into that, into making sure others are viewing you the way that you'll be successful, and still finding your self-value not in necessarily that, because that can, I'm sure, get discouraging at times and isn't sustainable with your values either. So
right.
It's kind of a unique dynamic that I'm sure is interesting to work through.
Yeah. I mean, that's a kind of a loaded question because there's a lot of different aspects, I guess, to it. I mean, one, with bodybuilding, it's subjective, and from the very get-go, like, you got to get over that or don't compete, because in some things it's like you work hard and you get X result, and that isn't necessarily the case. Like you may work harder than you've ever worked, and harder than any of your competitors work for a given competition, and you may not win. And so you have to know that, and then you have to know that it's subjective, and two different judges may judge you differently based on their personal preferences. And if you can't try and separate that from who you are as a person, like, bodybuilding will devastate you. So I always say, take it bowling and you can count the pins and it's black and white.
Right.
And I would say the hardest part, almost for me, from my standpoint, is my biggest fear of, like, not winning. Well, it's not so much winning. My biggest fear of not placing where I feel is fair is what it does to my wife. Like, I almost think it's harder to support a bodybuilder in some ways than it is to be the bodybuilder themselves. And Christina only competed one time in a figure competition back in 2003, I think. And she won the overall and retired. Thank God, because we didn't need two dieting people in the household.
Right.
But I remember I was a nervous wreck for her when she was competing. And so I have a small taste of what she goes through. But when she sees me suffer through a diet, work hard, and then maybe I don't place, where she thinks I should, I know how devastating and difficult that can be for the person that supports you. And so honestly, that's probably the more difficult part for me personally. And then I guess in regards to identity, a lot of people, their physique is their identity, be it in bodybuilding or maybe their numbers in powerlifting or whatever. And there's nothing to say, Joe, I'm not going to sit here and say my identity's in Christ, and when bodybuilding's over, I'm going to be just fine.
Right.
Like I may have a little bit of a crisis. I don't think so. Mainly because I just always go back to, who does God say that I am, by scripture. And that ultimately is what matters. And it isn't, Christianity is kind of a unique religion in that you don't have to earn the affection of God. Like God offers that as a gift through grace, through Jesus Christ. And all we have to do is accept that. And it's really difficult because all world religions and most humans, if you work hard to receive affection, like everything's conditional. It's almost impossible to love somebody, I believe, unconditionally. And so to know that you're loved unconditionally by the creator of the universe, that's very freeing if you can really grasp that, because then, you're not working to please man. And at the end of the day, when I die, I would hope he says, well done, good and faithful servant. You fought the good fight. You ran the race well. And that's all that's going to matter. Nobody's taken their car or their bank account or their bench or squat numbers or the circumference of their chest or biceps, like their trophies, their medals. Nobody's taken that with them when they're gone. And so, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive. But at the same time, like that's not who you are. Because you can see that in bodybuilders that when it becomes their identity, and then as their record fades, because it happens to all of us as we age, a lot of them then just become embittered at the sport, and they hate the sport that they once loved, primarily because they, I guess, feel rejected by it because they're not the superstar that they used to be. But there's way more to a person than how many Olympia titles they've won. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I think I appreciate your honesty too of, like you said, it's not like you can sit there and be like, give this Sunday school answer of, my identity is fully in Christ, and if bodybuilding is taken away from me today, I'd be perfectly fine. Because I think there's something to be said too for people realizing, it's okay for some of your identity to be in something you're really gifted at. And, so it's like there's nothing wrong with having some of that. And then also too, there's nothing wrong with not being perfect and working through, that being something that's really close to you. Because I think sometimes people can, whether it's like through injury or whatever, they'll get the sport will be taken away from them for a period of time, and then they feel like they're a shitty person because they're struggling. And it's like, well, you're also human too. So
right.
None of us, whether you have a relationship with God or not, none of us are under this false impression that we're perfect at it either. So I think it's good to hear that honest perspective too of like, it is a close part of your identity. It's not like could get taken away any day and we'd be like, okay, cool, that was nice.
Yeah. There was a time when I lived in a really awesome house, and had a jacked up truck and a motorcycle and all this stuff. And my business fell on some hard times. And I always said when I had all that stuff, like, money's not my idol. Like, you know, I'm charitable. I give it away. And I hit tough times and I was like, I'm going to sell everything. You know, we sold and downsized our house. I sold my truck. I sold my motorcycle. And like, my identity shouldn't have been in my bank account. And I realized that it really was, not because I'm like in tears that I don't care about that stuff, you know, now, but it was hard, especially I think as a man who feels like my job's to provide, and a lot of that stuff was taken away. I felt like, you know, I wasn't doing my job in a sense as a man. And so that was rough. And like I say, the same thing could happen with bodybuilding. I mean, I'm 42 and I always say I'm like way past my shelf life. I think I would have never thought at 30 when I turned pro that I would, you know, still be competing at 42. So I love to train, but my body hurts some days.
Yeah.
And so I'm not, I'll be sad when I stop competing, just because I had a lot of good memories there, and hopefully I'll always be able to work out. But being big is overrated too. I mean, after a while, it's like, who wants to be out of breath tying your shoes, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I think those are some really good points. You know, something that you talked about at, and I kind of talked almost a little bit about it with your wife, and then you talked a little bit about it at Elite FTS when you talked about your friends that you meet with for coffee once a week, and you chat about stuff, and they're kind of give you really honest feedback. And I think that's something that really applies to both the training side of people's lives, of like you mentioned, you need people to give you really honest feedback, whether it's about how you look or how your lifts look or how your training's going. And then on the life side, of people to give you honest feedback if they see you screwing up on something, and you know, there's a lot of other people that would just give you the right answers. How important has that been for you? You know, obviously you talked about the importance of your wife, but of even your other friends that you have that are close friends. How have you seen that play a role in your just life of competing over the last 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's been vital probably more to the health of my life outside of bodybuilding. It's tough because sometimes the guys that you run with at the gym, especially if they're not competitive bodybuilders themselves, like they see you 6 weeks out and think like, dude, you're Mr. Olympia shape. Yeah. You're ready to go. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Stop saying that. Yeah. But yeah, meeting with guys that are willing to be honest. I mean, I always talk about most men, it seems like, are hard charging, and we always want to be on offense. And so we never think of being on defense. And there's value in being on defense in regards to areas that you're weak. Like I was a total player before I met my wife. And so I have, you know, by the grace of God, he gave me a really hot wife. And so that's helpful. But at the same time, like I have to, you know, I know that. And so I can't take that lightly. Like she has access to every social media account, and it's just a check. And it isn't that I don't really need that, but it isn't to say that I wouldn't get sucked back into, you know, that type of mentality if I wasn't just everything's an open book. And same thing, you know, with meeting with these guys. I mean, we all have blind spots, be it in training, be it in whatever in life. But the key with blind spots is, as the name says, you're blind to it. That means you don't see it. That means you may be going down a path that's going to lead somewhere, and you don't have any idea that that's going to end up being a train wreck for your marriage, or a train wreck for your physique, or a train wreck for your body, and in regards to injuries or whatever. And that's why men, in my case, that I really trust, that are willing to be honest, and they have an outside perspective. And if they're willing to like point out blind spots, that's invaluable, because I'm not going to see them. I'm blind to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's interesting too. And I think social media plays a lot into it too. Of it's really easy to get caught in like these echo chambers where we just have people reaffirming us constantly, and you kind of get a little bit of a warped reality of things. And then it's like sometimes I've found it's helpful almost to have, and I'm sure in your case, some people who aren't necessarily plugged into the same world you are, because then they can give you some like outside perspective that's not like, they don't think of you as like maybe IFBB Pro Mark Dugdale, and they can kind of look at it a little more objectively. It's it seems like that's some kind of helpful too, from what I've seen of talking to people.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I have a good relationship with my dad, so I mean, I'll still call my dad for advice, at least say, give me your perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable too. So, I think there's a lot of really good things that'll be helpful for a lot of people as they work through, a big part of going through these interviews that I'm doing is, I never want to tell people, and I try to, even with the students I work with at the school, not necessarily tell people how I want them to think or approach situations, but, kind of the same thing with training. You're helping, Dave Tate is really big on helping people develop their own training philosophy. And I think it's the same thing with the mental side of things. And as people grow mentally and psychologically, of giving them different inputs and different perspectives, and allowing people to take some things from that to help them grow their own philosophy. And so I think a lot of the things you talked about will be helpful for people, as even if they're and I know your expectation isn't that everyone just immediately take and adopt everything you think. Same thing with me. But I think there's a lot of things that'll make people think outside the box, what they're thinking of now or how they're thinking now. To kind of, every time I kind of wrap up one of these, I kind of want to end it with like, obviously there's going to be context to any individual person of advice you would give them on how to become more mentally tough or whatever. It's always going to depend a little bit on their situation. But in general, what do you think is something, maybe particularly for younger competitors or athletes, that you think is something that is worth sinking some effort into to grow from a mental perspective, or something that's worth focusing on?
Yeah. From my perspective, I think the best thing that a younger guy could do that I, at times in my life, I didn't do, and that would be helpful, is that, we get so focused in tunnel vision, or we set a date for a specific goal. And I think it's helpful sometimes to back out and look really long term. Like, I know it's insane for a teenager to think 30 years down the road, but you should consider that. Think 30 years down the road, and think like, where do I want to be relationally with the people in my life? Where do I want to be with my career? Where do I want to be with bodybuilding or powerlifting or training? And maybe at that point, obviously, you wouldn't even still be competitive. And then back it up 20 years and say, where would I want to be there? Where would I want to be at 10 years? And basically reverse engineer. Don't try and say, what do I got to do? This is my goal, and work from today to the goal. Think beyond the goal, and then back up to the goal, and then back up, to where you are today, and start saying, what do I have to do today to achieve that goal and not sacrifice where I would like to be, even 10, 15 years after, let's say, I achieve that goal. Because at the end of the day, it's tough, man. Like, giving advice or trying to share wisdom with younger people,
Right.
Sometimes can be frustrating, because a lot of times they just don't want to hear it. And, but seriously, if you can think beyond what's right in front of you, winning the Olympia, setting that record or whatever in powerlifting, if you got to give up years of your life, or your body's so beat up that you can't function, I don't know, is that really worth it? And to an 18-year-old, that might be worth it, but 2 years on the backside of that achievement, it may not be.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think, to your point too, with, how hard it is to kind of give advice and wisdom to younger people sometimes, I think it's, and I think your wife actually said something similar to this when we were talking to her at Elite FTS, but, there's some mistakes where I think people just have to almost make them themselves to really learn from them. Like, there's certain things that you can say till you're blue in the face, but it just doesn't mean the same thing in their lives till they experience it. But I think it is helpful that if they can hear, I think there's things that I've heard from people and I didn't necessarily listen to the advice right away, but I think it helped the quickness of the learning curve when I started figuring it out myself. So I think when you get that advice, it's still helpful. So hopefully, at least when you start making the mistake, people will be able to think back and be like, oh, I did hear this a few times from some people.
Yeah. So plant the seed, whether or not it's going to germinate with that person and grow, doesn't matter. Like, it's our job to plant the seed, and hopefully, like you say, they won't make the devastating mistake before they're like, I remember him saying that. Maybe I should consider this. And I think if you can achieve that with some of the younger people, I think I would consider that a win. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time to do this, Mark. I really appreciate it. I think there's a lot of really good little nuggets of insight that I know are helpful for me as I think through a lot of things, and I think will be helpful for a lot of people as they look through different stuff. So thanks again for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe.